Ron Gouldian. He's the executive director of Men Having Babies. I'm Anthony Brown. I'm the chairman of the board of directors of Men Having Babies. I'm so happy to see so many people here. To give you a little bit of background on our organization, we started as a group of men at the Gay and Lesbian Center in New York who basically just wanted to get as much information as we could get about having our own biological families. So we started inviting in people who could answer our questions at monthly workshops, which we still have in New York. We invited in lawyers and doctors and agency representatives and surrogate moms and dads who had had children through traditional and gestational surrogacy. And then we sort of morphed that into our conference program. We now have 5 annual conferences: San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Tel Aviv, and for the first time on May 2nd and 3rd, we are entering into Europe, and we have a conference in Brussels. But something that Charlie alluded to, and I think what we're really most proud of with our organization, is our Gay Parenting Assistance Program, what we call GPAP. And I'm going to speak more in depth about that a little bit later on, but I just wanted to let you know that at the end of our first year, we just finished our first full year of the assistance program. I think it was now 11 or 14 individuals or couples, qualifying individuals or couples received around $750,000 in donated free services and cash grants, and an additional 90 individuals and couples received about $1 million in discounted services. And that was all part of the income from the conferences and the generosity of our donors here. So please, when you go upstairs, keep that in mind with the people that you're meeting with. Just to allude back to something that Judy said earlier when she asked if any of you were here at the last conference, I was so relieved that none of you were here at the last thing that we had a year ago. I was so nervous. I was crazy. I was dry mouthed and sweating, and it was nuts. And I was on the plane going back to New York trying to figure out what was going on for me. And I realized it had been about 7 years since my husband and I were sitting in the audience like you guys. And we were scared to death. We were trying to get as much information as we could. And it was the beginning of a journey that ended with our 5-year-old son. And I can't imagine our lives without him. So I'm saying this because Judy alluded to this also, but I'm going to put it flat out. At some point today, your heads are going to explode. There's going to be so much information, and some of it's complicated, and there's such emotion behind it, and the decision to have a family is so profound and so personal. But you have an incredible opportunity today. With the service providers upstairs, you can, at the very least, have all of your questions answered. And at the very most, and it's my sincere hope that you might meet the people who help you have your family today. So today, this morning, we have 2 basic parts. We're going to do an overview with some basic terminology to sort of introduce you to the process. I'm going to go over definitions, over the parties involved, the timeline, some of the medical steps and some of the legal steps, and then we're going to go into sort of your major considerations as intended parents. What you see your family to be, what you want that journey to look like. We're going to talk about gestational versus traditional surrogacy. We're going to talk about known egg donor donation versus anonymous egg donor donation, some of the medical decisions that you're dealing with, and finally some of the, and this I think is one of the most important, is the ethical and social considerations. In the second half, later on in the afternoon, we are going to talk about the resources available to you to expand your knowledge about the process, to meet people, to talk about finding the right agency and surrogate and donor and attorney. Then we're going to go, Ron's going to really talk about the budgeting issues and the costs, some of the best practices for saving costs. And then finally, I'm going to talk about our Gay Parenting Assistance Program in more depth, explain it to you. So let's talk about terminology. The basic definition of surrogacy is an altruistic act of a woman of gestating a child for another individual or couple with the intention of giving that child to the couple when it is born. And we use the word altruistic very purposefully. because I have never met a surrogate mom, and my surrogate mom Shannon included, I've never met a surrogate mom who has not understood deeply the profound nature of what they're doing. That it really is something powerful and intense and a bit of a gift. And I say that because most surrogacies are compensated surrogacies. But if in the course of your attempting to find someone to assist you, if you get the impression that it's all about the money, that's a huge red flag. There is you gotta find that seed of what it is inside their heart that makes them want to go through this process, because it's a huge process. I'm gonna talk about two different types of surrogacy. I'm gonna talk about traditional surrogacy and gestational surrogacy. And then I'm gonna talk about two ways of actually going through that. And one is independently, where you guys do the work yourself, and one is using an agency, where you have an agency who sort of coordinates all of the moving parts. So let's talk about traditional surrogacy. Traditional surrogacy is where your surrogate mother is also your egg donor. Artificial insemination or intrauterine insemination is the usual method of achieving pregnancy, not in vitro fertilization, so the costs can be much less. It can be done at home or it can be done in the clinic, but depending on where your surrogate lives and where you are, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about establishing parentage for the non-biological parent. You guys are so lucky that you live in California. California is one of the absolute best states for surrogacy. Back in New York, surrogacy is illegal. I'm an attorney. I do the second parent adoptions for couples who go through surrogacy in New York. And if I even helped consult on a surrogacy contract, I could lose my license. It's absolutely crazy. You guys are so lucky to be in California. The reason why I am mentioning this is because if you have a traditional surrogate and you do sort of a fresh direct or turkey baster kind of insemination, depending on whether where your surrogate lives and where you live, it may be harder to establish the parental rights of the non-biological parent at the end of the journey. We're going to talk more about this also. Oh, sorry. Also, interestingly enough, with traditional surrogacy, it can actually take longer than gestational surrogacy because they have perfected the medical process around gestational surrogacy so that the odds of you getting pregnant on the first try are increasing, and they're really consistent now. So it actually might take you longer to get pregnant with a traditional surrogate than with a gestational surrogate. So let's talk about gestational surrogacy. Gestational surrogacy is where the eggs are provided by a separate individual, an egg donor, and not the surrogate. The egg donor receives medications leading up to what's called the retrieval, where she has to give herself several shots, and it helps her to produce a lot of eggs. And usually in tandem, the surrogate mother is given several shots to help prepare her womb for the embryo. And then the egg donor goes to a clinic. The eggs are extracted in retrieval, sperm is added, embryos are created, and usually around 5 days later, they're implanted into the womb of your surrogate mom. And it's usually 1 or 2 embryos that are transferred. So those are the two sort of main topics about surrogacy, the 2 types of surrogacy. Now, how do you go about getting there? Independent surrogacy is basically where you find everyone on your own. I have so much respect for the guys that I know who have done this independently, because it is a lot of work. You have to coordinate to find your surrogate. People can use online services for that, or friends if they have referrals. Somebody who a friend has used as a surrogate who wants to do it again. You have to find your professionals on your own. Also, you have to find a clinic for medical screening and for the IVF or IUI procedure. You have to find an agency or a clinic for donor matching to get your egg donor. You have to arrange for an attorney to draft the surrogacy contract and represent you. And you also have to arrange for an attorney to represent surrogate mother in the surrogate contract. And finally, you have to arrange for an attorney for the parentage hearing, and that is the way that you establish the parental rights of the non-biological parent after the birth of the child. One thing with independent surrogacy that sometimes gets overlooked, and it's one of the most crucial aspects of the journey, is the sort of psychosocial screening and supports system that both you and your surrogate need. When you go to an agency, which I'll talk about, they tend to provide the kind of social worker network support. But in an independent surrogacy, sometimes people can feel all on their own. So if there is a way that you can factor that into your decision, it's going to make for a smoother journey for you. So agency surrogacy, basically, is where the agency screens, matches, and supports the parties. They act as a liaison between them. And personally, this was really important to me and my husband because our surrogate Shannon had a medical issue that arose during her surrogacy. And our agency provided us with a social worker, and they provided Shannon with a social worker. And through the social workers, we were able to negotiate this kind of tense and scary situation. So it was very helpful for us. The agency will also work with the clinic to coordinate the retrieval and implantation. They will draft the surrogacy agreement for you and represent you, and they will, or they will arrange for a surrogacy agreement to be drafted, and they will either handle or arrange for the attorney for creating parentage for the non-biological father. So let's talk about the parties who were involved. Number one, you guys. The intended parents. And the people that you're going to need, you're going to need either a surrogacy agency if you're doing it with an agency, or you're going to need the support independently and the research independently to screen and match with the surrogate, to coordinate the journey, and then to find egg donors if you're using a gestational surrogate. Second, an egg donor. For gestational surrogacy, you need a separate egg donor. If you're doing traditional surrogacy, you've got that one covered. And then around the egg donor, you're going to need the fertility clinic with medical screening and the IVF process. And sometimes the actual clinic itself can help you find egg donors. Third, we have the gestational carrier. And surrounding the gestational carrier, she needs to have an attorney to represent her in the drafting of, or in the execution of the surrogacy agreement. And if there is some kind of psychosocial support for her during that process, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, sometimes the agency will provide that. And finally, we have the baby. And again, it's critical that the non-biological parent understands what they have to do ahead of time to secure their legal rights with the child. So to talk about sort of a typical sequence and timeline, I'm going to hand it over to
Let me just say that naturally, since this is a complicated process, as we said, and we're going to continue reiterating, some of the concepts we're going to go back to. So we're giving you broader overviews, and then we're going to go into some more details of some of them. You need to try to arrange the flow in some way. So once again, there's not going to be a quiz, but this is more or less what happens. So typically, people start with choosing either an agency, a little more likely, or clinic first off. And most of what we're going to talk about from now on is gestational surrogacy, by the way. So it's actually a little misleading. People think that the traditional surrogacy is what means regular surrogacy, but really, when we surrogacy nowadays is mostly, I would say that easily 90+% of the guys who are doing gestational surrogacy nowadays is gestational surrogacy. But we'll have another slide when we compare the two. So people would typically find an agency and a clinic, and typically that sequence. There will be the beginning of some screening done immediately for them. There'll be the surrogate matching and surrogate pre-screening done right after that. Some agencies, not a lot, we have surrogates waiting to be matched. That's not typical. There will be then the contracts being, once there's a match sheet or something like that, there's a tentative match, there'll be the contracts drawn, and also at some point the beginning of what is here in blue, which is the medical track, where there will be also some screening starting first with the IPs, but then immediately the gestational carrier. The egg donor will be also identified either through the clinic or an agency around the same time. Egg donors typically don't take as long to match as gestational carriers do. They'll be appeared, and we'll go into the expert panel, by the way, is between the two parts of our workshop today. So to the extent that we're going to breeze through some of the medical and legal and psychological aspects, that's because they'll be covered at the expert panel in more details. So I'm not going to go into many details into this now. But just so for the terminology's sake, there'll be a retrieval of the eggs, there'll be the fertilization of the eggs and embryos created, and then there'll be the transfer. So those are the concepts you're going to hear a lot throughout the day. Once there's a transfer, hopefully, and nowadays in gestational surrogacy in the United States, it is most of the time there will be a pregnancy. If there is no pregnancy, then most of the time people are going to have frozen embryos. So they're not going back to square one, they're just going back to having another transfer. No need to do another IVF process. But meanwhile, throughout all this time, you see up there the red track, there's support and coordination. And then at some point, typically at the end of the first trimester, you're actually not in contact with your IVF clinic anymore. The surrogate will be taken care of by her own OBG or local doctor for every maternity care. Meanwhile, you're doing some legal prep and a birth plan to prepare for the hospital stay and the hospital phase, and hopefully, obviously, then in good timing, full-term birth. Briefly, Anthony's going to touch upon some of the legal steps.
I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but it's going to be covered pretty intensely at our expert panel. But as far as legal steps are concerned, the first thing that you want to ask from a strategic point of view is whether you're going to have gestational surrogate or a traditional surrogate. And it can make a difference in some states if you get something called a pre-birth order. A pre-birth order terminates the legal rights of the surrogate mom. And in some states, they won't do that with the traditional surrogate, but they will with a gestational surrogate, or they'll make it harder for you. You also, the key with surrogacy really is the law that applies is the law where the carrier gives birth. So if you go with an agency, your agency contract is going to have like a 2-page explanation of the law of that state where your carrier is going to give birth, because that's the law that's going to apply for the surrogacy contract. If you contract with an agency, the one part of the journey where you're not represented is when you sign with the agency. It's not the once you sign the surrogacy the contract with your surrogate, the agency's representing you. But when you sign with the agency, it's a big contract also. And if you have any questions about that, you should go to our Facebook page if you have questions. We have a great forum on our Facebook page. Talk to friends who have done it before. But I just wanted to highlight that that's the one area where you're unrepresented in the process. Once you sign with an agency, or if you are doing it independently, you arrange for an attorney to draft the surrogacy agreement. Your surrogate also has to be represented by an independent lawyer, and sometimes your egg donor, depending on how you get the egg, has to be represented by an independent attorney. And then the last aspect is a parental establishment, which can be done by pre-birth order. I believe in California, Deb Wald, I think, is going to talk about this. They can terminate the surrogate's rights and add both parents, the biological and the non-biological parent, onto a pre-birth order, which would get your name onto a birth certificate. In other states, if they're not available, back in New York, you have to go through a second or a step-parent adoption process. So we're going to move into phase 2 now of major questions that you need to ask yourself in the process. And the first is whether you want to have a traditional surrogate or a gestational surrogate. With a traditional surrogate, there is no need for an egg donor because she is your egg donor. There is no IVF because it's either turkey-based or artificial insemination or intrauterine insemination. So therefore, it is a much more affordable, from a medical perspective, a much more affordable process. And also, you have a known biological mother. If your traditional surrogate is open to, and I think most traditional surrogates that I've met are open to having a continued relationship with the intended parents, your child is going to know who their biological mother is, which is significant. With gestational surrogacy, the gestational carrier and the egg donor, we say can be best for their role, but basically you can really choose. There's so much more of a selection of egg donors that if you want the non-biological parents' ethnicity and hair color and eye color to be matched, or you can do that fairly easily with an egg donor, a separate egg donor. And also, it may be less emotionally difficult for the gestational carrier to surrender the child after birth if they have no biological relationship with the child legally. And there's also a less ambiguous role for the gestational carrier, both from her perspective and from the parent's perspective. And I say this with the profound understanding that nowadays, most intended parents have long-term relationships with their surrogates. They maintain really good communication with them, certainly during, but after the birth of the child as well. So that's the first question.
Let me just interject that at the Personal Stories panel, we're going to have both traditional and gestational surrogates. In fact, somebody who was both traditional and gestational surrogate himself. And a parent, a separate parent that had worked independently as well as with agency. So we're going to have another opportunity to go through and ask questions about how it worked out for people to do it that way. But this is an overview again, and we can get into more issues in question and answers. And just quickly, to choose a surrogate, we're going to talk later about where she's from, is she insured or not, is she experienced or not. We're going to cover that later when we talk about the various steps and ramifications of choosing a surrogate.
So next, you want to ask if your egg donor is going to be a known donor, a donor who allows herself to have a relationship with the child also, or an anonymous donor. With a known donor, you can get a personal impression from the person themselves. Holly is my husband's and my egg donor. We still have a great relationship with her. We met her whole family, so we got to ask all of these great questions that might not necessarily have been disclosed on the health form about her family history, and they may agree to meet the child afterwards, which is pretty emotional. By the way, I have to tell you, I'm prone to emotional outbursts, so if something happens and I get choked up, I'm just warning you now. Thank you. Anonymous egg donors, they are easier to find. There's a much wider selection for anonymous egg donors. The process is slightly less complicated because when anonymous egg donors make donations, the parental rights are surrendered upon donation for legal reasons. Again, later, we're going to talk about ways to locate if you're a donor can be a family or a friend, if you find your donor through an agency or a clinic, where your donor is located for the purposes of coordinating the implantation and retrieval and implantation, and finally, if they're experienced, because if your donor has the experience of having a successful pregnancy, they are actually, I think, rated higher, and they are entitled to a higher fee if they're successful.
As far as decisions you need to make, so there are a lot of things that are going to happen this way or that, but some of them are up to you, at least in part. So one of the first decisions you're going to have, once again, in gestational surrogacy, is whether the egg source is going to be what we call fresh, shared, or frozen. Most people, and that's the conventional way, is that there will be an egg donor identified. She will donate. She will go through the process and donate eggs just for you. Sometimes, in order to cut costs, especially if you maybe sometimes supplementing, if you have to go through another cycle since you don't have enough embryos left, or if you're going for a sibling, you have some embryos, you need to supplement them. There could be opportunities for you to use a shared donation cycle. So that means that in real time, there'll be another couple or individual that will be interested in the same set of eggs, and they will be both. You'll both be timed such that you can take advantage of that retrieval at the same time. But then an increasing number of IVF centers now are able to provide you with frozen eggs, a process that was considered experimental until just a couple of years ago, and now is used increasingly. And the advantage here is that you can share eggs, but you don't have to coordinate the timing with somebody else who's interested in that particular set of eggs. You can get smaller portions or larger portions of eggs. They're available obviously instantaneously. It's good sometimes for fallback if you're the last minute, there's not enough eggs retrieved from the donors that you shared. So, but typically if you choose that as your primary way to do it, those are progressively less expensive, each one of those. So that's a choice you have. It depends in part which clinic obviously you're working with. And then the other decision, that's typically done in a certain way, but is whether you want to have single or multiple embryos transferred. You may have a single child either way, but if you are open to the possibility of having twins, you are typically going to be advised to transfer 2 embryos. That could even sometimes result in 3 children, because they could still, there's a slight chance that they would split one of them. But an increasing number of clinics nowadays would recommend, a minority of them actually would mandate that you only transfer 1 embryo. An increasing number of parents, although I think still the minority, want to avoid altogether the possibility of having twins, and they would, which includes obviously some medical complications that could come with multiple pregnancies. So that's another decision you need to make. So once again, these are all decisions you want to think about now. I mean, maybe not have a final decision today, but those are decisions you want to have. Things to think before you sit in a room with the doctor and you know, get dumbfounded when they ask you those questions. And then the other thing that is also a choice and an option nowadays is whether you want to have genetic testing, not just done for the egg donor, which is something that is done as a standard fashion, but whether you also want to have the embryos, once they are created, screened or diagnosed for genetic irregularities. That process would allow sometimes to increase success rates. It is certainly a process that is recommended when people want to, when there's some possible genetic concern. So that in that case, it is sometimes mandated or very well advised. It is expensive, and we'll talk about it later, what the trade-offs are. These are decisions we just got over some decisions you're going to have to make, and the question is, how do you go about making those choices? So we think there are certain things you can think about, you know, together as a couple or by yourself before you start, that would help you when you make those decisions we just discussed. So first thing, think about your vision as far as what the family makeup you want to have. You know, if you want to have a larger family, for instance, it would be recommended to use frozen or a small number of frozen or shared eggs, for instance. So, you know, are you the kind of person who thinks that 1 is enough, or you think that if you're not going to have 5 and 3 dogs, the house is going to look empty? Think about it now. You know, think about whether or not, if you do not have the number of optimal kids you have in the first try, and the most you can have is 2, typically, would you be interested in doing another journey later on? Think about it now, because that is, you know, something that might determine, for instance, you don't want to use, you're less likely to want to use an experienced surrogate if you want to be able to have the same surrogate help you do another journey later on. So those are all decisions that you need to make ahead of time, or things you need to think of ahead of time. Paternity. Once again, if you're a couple, then there's the issue of, are both of you going to be body dads? Are you going to try that? Is one of you, is it more important for one of you or the other? That's something we'll touch upon later on as well. It's going to be discussed also on the expert panel, but it's something you want to start thinking about. You want to think about what your vision is, and here we will help you today, and the discussions you're going to have with the agencies are going to help you as well. The type of relationship you envision. So we talked about, you know, different traditional surrogacy, sometimes an independent surrogacy that lends itself sometimes to a different relationship and dynamics through the pregnancy and afterwards. Some people say we don't want a third wheel. You know, we're the parents, and you know, there's the doctor, the nurse, and the surrogate, and the egg donor. They're all helped create a family. We don't see a long-term relationship with the surrogate. That's fine, because some of the surrogates see it the same way. Just be sure to know what your vision is. Other people say the reverse. Just make sure you know what you guys both, and you need to know about yourself, because you might not have the same vision, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The same with the donor. Think about what is your expectation and what would work better for you. And then risk tolerance. Quite frankly, this is not a very straightforward linear track here. There could be things that go, I wouldn't even say wrong. I mean, we're talking about biology, science, things go this way or that. What is your personal tolerance for risk, because there would be options to get a multi-cycle package, a baby guarantee program. There are all kinds of things you'll be able to discuss with your providers that may be more suitable for you. As always, they might require higher premium upfront and less risk taking for later, etc. So think about, and there'll be other decisions that are going to be related to your personality in that regard. Same thing about personality or lifestyle or circumstances. How much handholding do you need? If you're the kind of person that have the time and that wants to be able to, micromanage or be very details oriented, that's one thing. If your circumstances are such and your personality is such that you need somebody to trust to do a lot of this and to give you advice, then that would yield to a slightly different selection or a completely different selection of providers and options. And lastly, certainly it depends on your circumstances and personality as well. There would be certain points where there will be a trade-off between cost and time, like many other circumstances in life. And we'll talk about when we talk about saving tips, cost-saving tips. And once again, I mean, you might be on the older side of the spectrum.
What are some red flags to look for in an agency?
What are the red flags to look for in an agency?
That's a really good question, because your choice of an agency is going to be entirely, it can be entirely just because of a personal spark that you have with somebody. I know with our agency, we met with the head of the agency and we met with the woman who would be our social worker. And it was her that made us feel comfortable and cared for. And it was our relationship with her initially that helped us to bond with that agency. I would say the biggest red flag is if a question that you ask isn't answered, or if it's answered in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable. Definitely pay attention to that. And I think that just the fact that you're asking this question is really good, because you're going to be diligent and looking for issues that come up. Also, there are a lot of representatives. And I encourage all of you today, please, to come back to the afternoon session, definitely the personal story session, and please do talk to as many of the providers that are here today as possible, because you're never going to know who you're going to connect with until you actually do it.
And I just want to add a pitch, that's one of the things that I found brilliant about the way that this conference is structured, because you will have an opportunity to speak with a lot of the providers who are here, hopefully any that are interested to you based on some initial choices you made about what process you wanted to make, or to try to explore that further and answer some of the questions that Ron and Anthony put out there. So I would really take advantage of those opportunities to talk with agencies over here.
And we'll go into more details about picking providers in the afternoon as well. So we have several slides, and we're going to talk about not necessarily red flags, that's a separate question, but also just what are the steps, the due diligence steps that you want to make, during which there could be red flags come up. So I think really ambiguity, avoiding to answer questions. But the other thing is, and we'll talk about that in more length. You want to make sure that they're doing what they're promising to do in the right sequence. So you don't want to have a situation where you get into a point where you're being presented a surrogate that has been screened, where that's not clear necessarily, and then you fall into a point where you feel emotionally committed to that surrogate, but if you knew what you later know after the screening, you wouldn't have even made that connection with it. So I would say that's because otherwise, you're supposed to be able to make a decision at any point in time to walk away from either a match or from an agency. But that, if the sequence is such that you feel committed to something emotionally, but cutting corners from the checklist standpoint of what you would want to have in an ideal surrogate, then that's a problem, I think. So I think people fall into that problem, and we'll talk about that more in the afternoon as far as what the sequence is.
Did you want to add, because I want to have time for one more question.
Yeah, just briefly, on the Men Having Babies website, we have something called a ratings table, where we're going to talk about that later on, but I just want to introduce it, that it's where basically parents have gone through the journey, have rated the agencies that they've gone through, and they've talked about their personal experiences, so that may be a place you might want to start.
Yeah, and personal connection, I can't emphasize the importance of feeling like you have the right person to work with you. So we're all great agencies here. One more question here.
We've talked a lot about surrogacy, but there was very little so far about the egg donors themselves. Will there be more talk about that later on?
By all means,
What's your
The
question?
thing that I was more curious about, you mentioned anonymity. Sorry, maybe I'm not saying it right, but you got me. So I'm curious about the medical background, the genetic background, and how does that play long-term into the life of the child and the grown-up, and what kind of history does he or she have access to?
I just want to repeat the question so everyone can hear it. So the question is, what kind of information do you get on the egg donor, and how does that impact the child moving forward?
So we will go into that. So the experts are going to go into a little bit of that, and we'll talk about, the steps, the checklist, as far as what you want to look into and how and where you can find an egg donor. But let me do say that in general, a lot of people come here to this room say, we would have, considered adoption, we would consider this, consider that, and then somehow they find a way perhaps to this option. But then once even though they would have theoretically would have considered adoption, where you have very little information about the genetic background and very little say about those things, it's tempting once you get into the process to really feel like, oh my God, I can control these things. How about sense of humor? How about how she feels about this and that, or politics. But the truth of the matter is that that's a really quick way to get derailed, and a very typical way to find yourself in a point where your process gets prolonged, and even the success rates might go down, because you start getting into the illusion, in my personal point of view, that all these are things you can order, order by catalog type of thing. You can, and the truth matters. Think about your siblings. You have the same genetic materials. How do they have the same sense of humor you have? Do they go to the same party? Are they as skilled, in piano, in music as you are? The answer is that my personal opinion is it's very easy to get carried away when it comes to the genetic material, thinking that will determine everything. So I'm saying, other than that, we'll talk about the checklist and the sources.
And I think that also is a good. I think those two questions together are as important as that is to you. Is also some way that you personally might want to help determine which clinic or how you choose your donor.
But I want to say one more word about anonymous versus known that perhaps will not be otherwise discussed later. Is that there's a lot of discussion nowadays about the psychology of kids later on, about how they feel about their birth story, about their origins, and generally there's a movement towards at least having the option of having various levels of not anonymity. So it could be known, it could be identifiable, it could be somebody that's willing to be in touch later on. None of that is guaranteed. She could be willing now when she's 20 to 21 to be in touch with you, but later she could change her mind. But a lot of guys nowadays find themselves in the point in which they say, I wish I had at least that option early on. And I would just do a plug here that on our website we have the video of the team panel, the first team panel we ever had, of teenagers that are now, that have been going through surrogacy to the day that. So we did that just a couple of months ago in New York, and it's easy to see how they think about those issues in retrospect of surrogacy.